Hi, and welcome to the Kubernetes podcast from Google. I'm your host, Abdel Seguiwar.
And I'm Caslin Fields. We are so excited to celebrate the 10-year anniversary of Kubernetes coming up on June 6th, 2024. To join in the fun, we're doing a series of 4 special episodes diving into the Kubernetes journey over the last decade and looking into the future. This episode will feature active leaders in the contributor community who have been around since the early days. Future episodes will feature other prominent community members from the very beginning, new leaders guiding Kubernetes into its second decade, and community members with deep high-performance computing and AI/ML backgrounds who will share how the focus on these workloads has changed for the project. In this first episode of our 10-year anniversary series, we speak to SIG chairs and longtime contributors Davanum Srinivas, aka DIMS, David Eads, and Federico Bongiovanni. But first, let's get to the news.
Istio 1.22 was released. In this new major release, ambient mesh was moved to beta, Istio core APIs moved to V1 from V1 beta 1, the gateway API support is now stable, and a lot of other features have been added. Check the release details in the show notes.
The Gateway API project released version 1.1. Several features have graduated to GA in this release, notably service mesh support, gRPC route, and many more.
Traffic Labs announced Traffic 3.0. The new version of the cloud-native proxy introduces support for WASM, OpenTelemetry, SPIFFE, and the Kubernetes Gateway API.
Microsoft Build, Microsoft's largest developer conference, took place in Seattle, Washington, May 21st to 23rd. Many of the announcements from the event centered around Copilot, Microsoft's AI offering. Announcements included a new .NET cloud-native development stack called .NET Aspire, a new version of C#, and many more.
The Kubernetes birthday bash party at the Google Bayview campus is coming up fast on June 6th. If you can't make it to the party in California, there are over 50 Kubernetes regional events happening around the globe. Check out cncf.io/Kubernetes to find a 10-year anniversary event near you.
And that's the news. Today we're speaking with David Eads. David is a senior principal software engineer at Red Hat. He started contributing to Kubernetes before V1 and now serves as a sig-auth tech lead and SIG-APIMachinery tech lead and chair. Welcome to the show, David.
Hi, nice to be here.
So first off, we're going to start off with an icebreaker because a little behind-the-scenes know-how for everybody. In our interview planning docs, we actually have an icebreaker segment, and I usually forget that it exists. But I'm going to try to use that more often.
It's just because mine is the most interesting.
It is, so please.
One of my favorite stories is one where it's not even software related, but I just love building things, and I have for years and years and years. And so when I was a teenager, I decided I was going to build a boat. And this is dating myself just a little bit, but it was pre that time where you would just look up like how to make a rowboat online. And so I had a picture of a rowboat from like a cartoon, and I was going to build it in my backyard. And
go great.
I figured out how I could bend my wood using these trees that I had, because it was the tools I had available. I had to make it work. And so I bent this boat. It looked beautiful. I got it all together, spent hours and hours putting this thing together. And then finally that evening, I go to show it to my dad for review. And I think he's going to be so proud of me. And he just sort of stares at it for a while. And he goes, "How are you going to get the tree out of the middle of your boat?" and I had cleverly built my boat with a tree right in the middle of it. And some significant refactoring later, and I had not cut down the tree. I had successfully reorganized my boat and put it back together alongside. But I have gotten better at building things since, but I still just love it and whatever comes up.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
You lived the dream of, I saw a thing in a cartoon and then I made it. Definitely have had a few of those moments.
Yes.
Love it.
Good times.
So did the boat work in the end?
Oh, it was a terrible boat. It floated really, really well, but because I had like a picture of a boat and a handsaw, I didn't know that boats had to sit like low, like 10 inches tall. So I made the seat of my boat like twice as high as normal. So it was the tippiest thing on earth, and it had no keel, and it was awful. My future boats were all much better.
So you made more boats after this. You didn't get...
Oh, my boating misadventures go on and on and on.
Wow. Well, that's a whole other episode.
Yeah.
But today, we are excited to be talking about the 10-year anniversary of Kubernetes. And you have been contributing to Kubernetes for quite some time. We mentioned in your intro, since before V1. And now you're doing sig-auth and SIG-APIMachinery. So tell me a little bit about what your journey has been like. How did you start out?
Accidentally. So I got hired in 2014 by Red Hat. And at the time I got hired, they were hiring me to work on a Ruby application that was OpenShift at the time. And then by the time my first day came, instead of getting handed like a Ruby manual, they said, what do you know about Golang? Have you ever heard anything about containers? And do you know anything about this thing called Kubernetes? And so I looked and said, I've heard of Go, but never used it. Don't know what a container is, and Kubernetes just sounds weird. And so it turned out the project was really, really young still. And I joined. My first PRs were fixing kube API server error messages and making kubeconfig files a thing. Like kubeconfigs didn't exist. And yeah, it went from there with like all the pieces that you need after that. So it was, how are you going to make authentication work? So like the very baby steps of sig-auth, like designing RBAC and things like that, and expanded from there. I've done work in SIG apps and a bunch of the infrastructure pieces over the years, but APIMachinery is still my favorite.
And in that early of days, there weren't SIGs yet, right? It was just kind of you come in and work on whatever you can find.
Yeah, you come in and you work on whatever needs fixing that particular day. It was really wide-ranging. All sorts of stuff that you think of today just didn't exist. So like namespaces. Namespaces did not exist when I started on the project.
And you mentioned kubeconfigs didn't even exist. I don't know that I even remember that.
Yeah, kubeconfigs didn't exist. One of my favorite issues of all time is one where Eric Toon, he's stepped out for a while now, but Eric Toon had an issue and said kubeconfig merging causes hair loss as title of issue. And yeah, it was a heck of a thing to fix.
Oh, I've got to find that and put that in the show notes.
I love it. So yeah, that came in, and just all sorts of core primitives people take for granted today just weren't there.
Yeah, just creating the baseline even.
Yeah, I would describe that, or those early days, as like the finding purpose days of Kube. Like how do we get to a point where we can run something useful that people want to use? How do we get to a point where we can scale it to like at least 1,000 nodes before it falls over? How do we handle basic security principles to make this thing go? And it was really rapid and fast.
Interesting. So you come into Red Hat, new, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, and they're like, congratulations, now you're a container person.
Yes, it was exactly like that. And in particular, they came up and like, we need to have an authentication and authorization story, and we need to be able to add types and figure out how to make all that work. Oh yeah, and we don't have a CLI that works really well yet, so we can do there.
So you dive right into these kind of core fundamentals with a little bit of guidance on direction. And from there, what is the path like? What were kind of some of the most pivotal moments so far in your Kubernetes open source career?
Yeah, so thinking through that, are you interested in sort of the tech aspects? Are you interested in the ecosystem growth? Are you interested in like personalities that were there back then? Where would you like to go?
Yeah, those are some interesting potential paths here. It is the 10-year anniversary. So I imagine some of the folks listening today are interested in the history of where the project came from. Probably a lot of folks are interested in that. Hopefully everyone. And I imagine some folks out there are interested in getting involved in the project themselves. So kind of with that framing of those folks might be listening to us today, what would you say are some of the pivotal things that you've experienced?
So there's that first stage from about pre-1.0 till, I'll call it maybe 1.3. And during that time frame, we were trying to figure out what we were going to build, how people were going to basically use the thing. And that's when you see the development of namespaces and services. And as you start releasing, you get to see more things around workloads. So you see replication controllers, deployments, jobs. They're evolving during that time. And we pretty rapidly got a core set of use cases that the really devoted people could actually run and try to use. And then from there, I'd say from like, like 1.3 to 1.9, 1.10, there were a lot of scaling issues. Basically, people wanted to use it. They were willing to put up with it. And you saw tremendous forces placed on us to hit scale numbers. And so places like APIMachinery and SIG-Apps, we ended up looking at it and saying, what do we need to do to make ourselves more efficient so that we can run with less than 50 gigs of memory or something like that? And all sorts of projects evolved in that time. etcd evolved, a lot of the apps pieces evolved, the clients evolved. We developed things like protobuf. And so, we found that need and we pushed forward on that. And then from about 1.8, maybe 1.8, all the way up through, I would say 1.21, we were in a stage where we were trying to foster an ecosystem, right? It was back very early that Brendan Burns had identified a need to have people be able to plug in their own kind of resources. To say, I have this new type of API. How do I get it on there? Because I need to coexist with you in your system. And that insight was great, but the implementation needed a little bit of work. So we invested a tremendous amount of time, because it's not just that you have to be able to define a type. You have to be able to define a type that works like all the other types in the system. And that's why today you can install a CRD and suddenly you have access to it, right? That's not an accident, right? That's RBAC being built, new features being added, CRDs working with the same core implementation to be able to have all the pieces come around it and work with a working client ecosystem and run. Things like admission webhooks developed during this time so that it was possible to extend this system. And we were really successful there, right? You looked at KubeCons at that time and you were seeing all sorts of projects popping up trying to build on those concepts. And that's where you get all sorts of operators managing various pieces, different apps running, and cluster extensions being possible. And that was a really exciting time. And then it got to a point where we've got all this stuff to add, and now we're in a stage where it's not working super well together. And it's not the case that everyone has a PhD in Kubernetes. And so I would say somewhere around that, like 122, you can see us really trying to say, okay, how can we get to a point where our ecosystem can actually produce things that our average kube admin can run and actually manage? So there's been a lot of attempts at simplification there, reducing of operational complexity. And you can see that in new features that are things like validating admission policy, which eliminates network dependencies and makes things more reliable, or server-side apply, trying to make it so that clients can coexist on different API resources and not fight with each other. And I think those are going to be, well, they are really valuable things, and people are going to start leveraging them more and more now that they've gone GA.
And I think what you were saying at the beginning there is you've shown the whole journey, really, from like the beginnings to the really recent maturation of the project. And something that you mentioned there really reminded me of the Gateway API. When you were talking about those early days when you were just trying to figure out use cases and kind of build the things that those use cases would need. The story that I heard around Gateway API is they built the ingress object in Kubernetes. And that was one of those cases where they kind of came up with a use case and they built what they thought it needed. And then they realized later on that it wasn't quite exactly what that use case really needed. And so they ended up redesigning it into Gateway API. So
that's an amazing example. So if you look at it, a lot of those extension pieces that I described that we built for the ecosystem to use, they didn't exist when Ingress was created. And so you fast forward and then you look and you say like, well, why is it built this way? It really should work like that. And like, sure, it's obvious now, but it wasn't obvious then. And you can even see that carrying forward today. So one of the most popular talks at KubeCon in Paris was the reference grant talk. Like that room was packed. And they were sitting there trying to figure out how can we solve this problem. It evolved out of the Gateway API project, where it was a need to say such and such has to have access to this thing, and I have the power to grant that. And I'm really looking forward to what that unlocks once we finally develop it.
Yeah, there's a lot of chicken and egg problems throughout Kubernetes history. Like, we think we'll need this, so we build this, but it was kind of
definitely
one first and not the other.
Definitely. And you don't always predict it accurately. There's some where you predict it and it works out pretty well. Like RBAC is a great example of one of those things where we did a great job figuring out what people really needed in that first go round. And it has aged incredibly well. I mean, it's still the backbone of authorization after 8 years, and has been extended to work with new concepts.
Iteration is one of those core tenets of technology.
Yeah. And I guess on the other side, you have something like namespaces, where namespaces have been incredibly valuable for what they are. But I was there when namespaces was made. I remember arguing with Tim Hawken, and Tim was saying, we have to have hierarchical namespaces. We need namespaces nested in namespaces so that our project will age well. And I remember sitting there and arguing against him and saying something like, Tim, we can barely handle one level of namespaces. If we develop 2 levels of namespaces, it's just never going to work. We'll never be able to get this thing working right. And I can look back now and I can say, yeah, Tim was right. I wish I had hierarchical namespaces. You can get a certain degree of depth with one hierarchy, but I wish we had been able to come to an agreement about, are we going to have associated sets of projects that may or may not overlap, or are we going to have a hierarchy of them, and how could we build that? And the things we might have been able to build on top of that system would be really, really cool.
And that is a really nice anecdote to show how things kind of worked in the early days and how they've kind of evolved. Are there any other favorite anecdotes you have from your time on the project?
I guess I do have one, actually. There was a time back when the project was a lot less formal. And so I needed to communicate an idea of security boundaries. And it was a discussion with myself and Eric Toon and Daniel Smith. And I had the idea in my head and I didn't have the software right there. And I grabbed my kids' crayons and I drew a bunch of pictures in crayons and I took a picture of them on the table and I uploaded it to the GitHub issue. And it started being referred to as the crayon issue. We have to resolve the crayon issue. And it was great. It communicated the idea. It was just fun to get to do it that way. And it's not that we couldn't do that now today, but today there's a lot more structure around it. You'll generally create a presentation, put it into a cap, and make nice diagrams. But I will say I will give bonus points to any contributor who sends me a cap with a picture drawn in crayon. Guaranteed review from me.
I love it. I have actually run some workshops internally for my colleagues to talk about how useful it can be to just diagram something out with just crayons or whatever you have available to you, because having something visually can help connect the dots when you're trying to explain an abstract technical concept.
Yeah, I love it. And it comes in, it's got easy colors. It's easy to draw. My 5-year-old was doing it when I stole her crayons to make my picture.
Yep.
And it's so much faster in many ways than trying to build that perfect diagram. Let's get the you idea here and you got the actual shading and let's talk.
And so we've talked here about a few different early design decisions and how they've aged. But are there any particular early design decisions that you were involved with? And how do you think those have aged?
So I think RBAC aged particularly well. The design originated as a downstream project. It was on the Red Hat side. And someone from CoreOS, separate companies at the time, said, hey, I really need this in Cube. Could I take it forward? And when we took it into Cube, it was basically a straight port. But as we started looking at how people needed to build on top of these roles that we had, roles like editor and view, we discovered that when you have a mutable type system where custom resources can be created at any point in time, you need to have a way to have that same flexibility in your permissions model. And so we were able to extend that design really nicely with a concept called aggregation. Now, again, we weren't perfect, so looking back on it, we might have implemented that differently. But that core concept is a great example of us making a decision at the beginning. It carries forward now. And I know there's spots where people look and say, gee, I just wish I had. And the most frequent one is, gee, I just wish I had negative rules. And that was highly contentious. I want you to be able to do everything except. And at the time we were telling people, no, we can't give you that negative matching rule. There was a lot of frustration. And that was a highly contentious decision. And yet, if we had done that, the ability to then extend the model for CRDs to say, you're adding a CRD, go ahead and add your permissions now, would be far more challenging, because instead of being strictly additive, if you were adding something important that you didn't want everyone to be able to touch, and someone had a rule of everything except, well, now you've accidentally granted access to that thing. And so there's it's an API everyone uses. It's an API many people think they want negative matching rules on, but if we had done it, it would have made that fostering the ecosystem stage when we're trying to get more and more CRDs in there and make it easier to use practically impossible.
Interesting. I feel like it's really hard for folks on the outside to see those kinds of decisions and their effects. If you're not following those specific things for a long period of time, it's hard to see how something so intuitive. I feel like a lot of people would naturally describe, the roles that they want using that negative terminology, but it's hard to think through all of the implications that such changes might have. And that's why a lot of changes in Kubernetes these days take a very long time.
That is actually exactly why, right? We're sitting there and we're saying, where is this likely to go, right? When we're going to enable some new feature to make node extensions easier, is this choice that we're making here going to make those node extensions harder to build and thus limit us in the next AI enablement stage? And we're trying to avoid problems like that.
And so RBAC is very closely tied with your work, I assume, in sig-auth, since it's role-based. Mm-hmm. Is it authorization control or authentication?
Role-based access control. But
access control, there we go. Which I think is very closely tied to both authorization and authentication.
Yeah.
But I feel like people don't know what SIG-APIMachinery is. So could you talk a little bit about the work that you're doing today in both sig-auth and SIG-APIMachinery?
Sure. I guess I would say the APIMachinery covers the ability to serve APIs out of etcd and the client libraries that use them for manipulation. So you can think of us as providing the basis for most of the controller code that you have. So things like work queues and informers, if you go down to that depth, as well as the basic client libraries that you would use to interact in Go. And so when we look at what we need to do there, we're looking at things like how do we enable novel kinds of APIs and extensions to be developed. And so the most current things you'll be seeing are things like server-side apply, where we're making it easier to own a particular set of fields. And you'll see other pieces like field selectors for CRDs, where how do I select the set that is important to me? And then the combination of those two things actually works really well if you can also extend it to auth and be able to say, this user can see the CRD that has this kind of field set. And if you have the combination of all of that, it becomes possible for you to do things like per node extensions. You're able to look and say, I have an extension, it is on this node. It can manipulate only things related to this node in my custom API type. And here is how we have the pieces to do the permissioning and access on that. And so those two SIGs in particular, they're really sympathetic in terms of power you get and then how you control that power.
Interesting. So APIMachinery is kind of the world of kubectl and any kind of API you might use to interact with Kubernetes.
APIMachinery is more the aspect that kubectl talks to. So we own things like the transport, and SIG-CLI owns kube control. Back in the day, it was the same people, but we've sort of since branched off. And so, for instance, APIMachinery is working on something called a streaming list, and it will vastly improve memory utilization on an API server. We have to develop both the server side of that, so the server can do it, and the client side of that, so the clients do it. And if we do it right, then kube control will automatically do it, and therefore you will end up with overall reduced load. So it's a lot of second order stuff. API server develops the feature, auth makes it possible to control access to it, APIMachinery develops all the clients, they can then access it, and then those clients get used everywhere you're going to need them.
By things that SIG-CLI creates.
Yeah, CLI and apps are the two biggest consumers that we have. Well, sorry, I forgot about Node. I like Node. But
all of the SIGs are just tied together.
Yeah, we do centralize right around this point, right? Because everyone has to authenticate, everyone has to be authorized, and everyone has to have the right constructs and efficient ones to be able to access the server.
And I think a lot of folks out there, if you're a user of Kubernetes, you might not be familiar with the way that Kubernetes contributors organize their work. So hearing about SIGs, the special interest groups, might be a new thing to you. But I think when you dive into it, it makes a lot of sense. Like, we need to do all of these different things, and each one of these pieces is too big for any one person to handle all of them. So they get split up into smaller chunks, and that's how SIGs work.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And we try to provide the value that the SIGs want. You have other examples where it's things like sig-auth wants to be able to have more efficient encryption in etcd. And to do that, they want a new API machinery feature. And to do that, they end up getting direction from SIG-Arch about, like, here's the list of things you need to do if we're going to change this particular piece of surface area that will affect every SIG out there. And so, we go forth and do. But yes, it's split up to achieve those things.
Go forth and do. The contributor motto.
Indeed.
And so this is the 10-year anniversary of Kubernetes that we're coming up on here. So a last question for you. What would you like to see next for Kubernetes?
I know you are going to get tons of answers that say, I want to get API enablement or AI enablement. And don't get me wrong, I care about that too. But I think that there's a lot to be said about, like, how do we look and achieve that? And I think that on that journey, we need to focus in maybe two big areas, right? We're going to need to have a way to have per node extensions. And you can see this in spots where, like, you get specialized hardware, and that's where the fan out happens on the node, where they have to handle this hardware and that hardware and the other hardware. And it has to be somehow leverageable with a higher level construct. And we haven't yet built that, like how that will work. The other one that I see is trying to establish new API and controller patterns that don't yet exist. They are different than what has come before, but we don't know how different yet. And so we need to be extending into that area and saying, what new core machinery constructs do we need in order to support the controller constructs that are going to have to exist in order to know what the authorization constructs will be to be able to have all those pieces come together. And you can see spots where that's starting today.
I think that's a beautiful description of something that I think is really hard for folks to grasp, is that there's all this AI hype happening and all of us are having to kind of shift and become AI experts and all of that. But AI is very interesting in that it really goes all the way down in the hardware. And so with a distributed system like Kubernetes, where you have a lot of hardware and you're trying to run applications across it, it's a great use case actually for Kubernetes. There's a lot of synergy there, but it does mean that there's a lot of considerations for the project to make that it hasn't had to focus on as intently before. Like you were saying, we need to think more about how we expand the types of hardware that are available on the node and how the applications use those. And so there's all of these, and like the extensions, the controllers, the CRDs, how are those going to have to change to enable these new, very hardware-specific types of workloads? I think is a really interesting problem, actually, for the project.
It really will be. And when you look and think about the sort of progress that's going to get made there, right? If we make progress to support things like DRA, then we're going to get all sorts of unexpected intersections that are going to benefit on the side, right? So if we make a particular way to handle the APIs for DRA to work great, it will probably benefit every CNI and CSI that we have as well. For those that don't know, that's the networking interface and the storage interface. Those are per node today, and they're somewhat rough around the edges when you go to use them as a user. If we manage to solve this problem for DRA, we're almost certainly going to make things like that easier and better, both for the people writing the workloads and for the people running the clusters.
And that's also going to be important for another very popular topic in the Kubernetes world, which is like multi-cluster. Even more expansion. Scale is still an issue today. So these AI workloads and the things that we'll have to do to run those effectively could actually have effects beyond those AI workloads to help the project run better in other use cases.
I think you're probably right there. So the scheduling constraints that end up getting built, right? There's going to be brand new scheduling models that are going to have to get created to say, how do I know when to run this? How do I know when to preempt and how to preempt? And figuring out where those land in between single cluster and multi-cluster and how you can actually decimate the information so that the scale doesn't crush you. You have so many nodes, but how do you not have 10,000 different items for the 10 things that you have on every one of your 1,000 nodes? Figuring out how to abstract that out properly is going to be really cool.
Awesome. I'm looking forward to what the future holds. Thank you so much for joining us today, David.
Yeah, it's been a great time. I love talking to you.
Today we speak to Dims. Dims is a principal engineer at AWS, a long-term contributor to Kubernetes who served in multiple committees for the project. And today you are in the Technical Oversight Committee, or TOC. Welcome to the show, Dims.
Thanks a lot. Happy to be here, Abdul.
How is it going? All good?
Yeah, everything is awesome.
Nice. All right. So we are doing this as part of the 10 years anniversary for Kubernetes. We are talking to some old-term contributors, kind of newer generation contributors. Before I get going, are you planning to go to the birthday bash party in the Mountain View?
I wish. I live in Boston, though.
Oh, wow. That's far for you.
Yeah, the wrong time zone to be in the party.
All right, well, that's too bad. Cool. I wish I could be there, but I'm going to have to do 2 different meetups actually for the 10 years. So.
Wow, okay.
Yeah,
I think I already have the t-shirt that Tim Hawkins designed, so I think I'm all set.
Good. We all know that swag is important.
Absolutely. That's the lifeblood of the community.
That's why we're doing this, right?
Yeah.
Right. Just kidding, of course. So let's get going. You've been part of this community, actually, the Kubernetes community, since the early days. How did you start out? What was your origin story?
I've been doing open source a while, floating between different projects and different foundations. So my introduction to Kubernetes was when I was working on OpenStack. So when I showed up in the community here, I was labeled the OpenStack guy. Nobody calls me OpenStack guy anymore here. And now I've been adopted by this community. So that feels good. Mm-hmm. And the introduction was how do you best run Kubernetes on top of OpenStack? That's how I got started. There were a couple of projects that we started in OpenStack itself around how do we stitch things together? How do you make it run better? And one of the first things that I ended up doing was doing a cloud provider for OpenStack. Mm-hmm. And that's how I got to know about the in-tree cloud provider. And I'm going deep into the weeds here.
Please do.
That was my introduction to okay, this is a vibrant community and they're thinking about extensions. They are thinking about lots of scenarios that I love doing. So, and naturally, slowly, I drifted deeper into the code and the community and having a lot of fun doing so.
I see. Is that what gave birth to eventually OpenShift at some point?
So OpenShift has been there right from the beginning, even before I was part of it. I have never done OpenShift or Red Hat per se.
Okay.
But OpenShift is more about an opinionated distribution of Kubernetes itself.
Got it.
OpenStack was essentially a private cloud on using virtual machines and bare metal and things like that.
Yeah. I worked with OpenStack in the past. I was just thinking right. Because a lot of times people, when they talk about OpenShift, it's usually, okay, that's just OpenStack plus Kubernetes. But as you said, it's more...
There are still a lot of people doing integration work between the two communities. There's the cloud provider for OpenStack is still there. The cluster API provider for OpenStack is also very vibrant. And Red Hat folks are working on both those things as well. So it's all good.
Yeah. It's also because OpenStack is quite popular in the telco world. So that's what makes the project still kind of going strong, I guess.
Right.
All right. So were there, in this whole time that you've been involved, was there any pivotal moments for you? Something that was an aha moment?
Well, one thing that I can call out is when Brian Grant asked me to be part of the SIG architecture leadership team. So I was okay, I'm getting the keys to the kingdom. Though it is a lot of responsibility in terms of herding the cats and making sure that all the... So it turned out to be a good fit for me because I always think of myself as a maintainer mode. Mm-hmm. And I'm not super into I can switch gears when needed for sure, but at heart, I'm a maintainer. I want the code base to be clean and I don't want too many moving parts and reduce the dependencies and make sure things are working in the long term. So that is where I operate best, running the code base and trying to get people to work on the right set of things. So that's where my heart is. And that turned out to be very good for me here.
Got it. So then speaking of architecture, and we know that being part of SIG architecture means making decisions. Was there any early design decision that you were involved in? And how do you think that aged?
I told you about the cloud provider stuff,
Yes.
right? So I've been involved in that work for ages, right? Like if you go back to the initial issues that were open and the first cut of the caps and whatnot, actually the work started even before we had caps. So that's a whole another story. There was a point when there was no enhancement proposals. Like, can you even believe it?
So anybody can just write a pull request?
Yeah, anybody could merge code. Wild, wild west. But yeah, I think that was one of the things that, the community should be very super proud of. Right at the beginning, it's a monolithic, code base and like a mono repository specifically. So everybody wanted to land their code and all the code went into the same repository. And so everybody had their own vendor libraries that they wanted to bring in and there were duplicates and whatnot. And the kubelet was becoming too big and so on and so forth. So we went through the process of okay, can we remove all the cloud providers, all the credential providers, and make sure that everybody can ship at their own pace, right? Like they don't have to depend on Kubernetes to ship. They can make their changes, fix CVs, do their own patches, and be awesome in their own space and still be part of Kubernetes, right? So a lot of the decisions were intentional, the CSI drivers, the CRI drivers, and the external cloud providers. So I think that has worked out really well for us in terms of exploding the community as such. Not just the Kubernetes, right? If you go to CNCF projects, there are 140, 180 projects, and a lot of them have one way or another a relationship with Kubernetes.
Yes.
And all that is because of the decisions that were taken here, even before my time, way before my time as well.
Yeah. So I know that we said we want to reflect about the past, but now that you're talking, I remember the tweet, the last code removal, 1 million plus line of code removed.
Yes.
And I think you tweeted it as in, this is one of the best way you can contribute to a project is just contribute a pull request that removes code.
Yeah. I mean, just to be clear, it is vendored code.
Yeah. Vendor code.
Not actual code that...
No, Kubernetes still works, right? So
right. Yeah, absolutely. Kubernetes still works. You don't have to worry about it. It's just that was a really good cleanup, for sure. So over a period of time, we did a bunch of things, right? 127, we cleaned out the AWS cloud provider. And then 128, we did one more. And then, over a period of time, the VMware cloud provider, and then the Azure cloud provider was the one that went in just before this. So over a period of time, every release, we were able to clean some of these things up. And then finally, the big one has been the Google cloud provider, which you saw the tweet about.
Yeah, so that's the 130, basically, the last version.
Yes.
Cool. Nice. Yeah, I just remembered that I was on Twitter and I saw your tweets and I found it funny. So
yeah, it's actually going to go into 131.
131.
So,
okay. Yeah. So the next release. Okay, cool.
But there is no difference to people using the Kubernetes itself, right? Most of this is around how cloud providers integrate with their distros and things like that. And we have, out of tree cloud providers for everything already, and everybody has switched to it a long time ago.
Yeah.
It's just that it was tech debt that was piled up and we had to clean it out over a period of time, and we were able to pull that off.
Cool. Awesome. So can you tell us any anecdote, one of your favorites over these 10 years of involvement?
The thing that I really, really love is how we kind of launch the community in India, right? If you see the contributors that are coming into Kubernetes, we have a lot of students coming in. We have a lot of people in important positions within the community from the Indian subcontinent, not just India. And that all started when Nikita came and joined us through Red Hat as an intern. I've always been bothered by the fact that whichever open source foundation or project that I'm in, we don't really have an Indian identity, so to say.
Yeah.
And I was okay, what can we do different here, right? So we started a lot of people don't even know this. There is an InDev Slack channel, which is very popular with folks from India. And when we see folks asking questions and things like that, we add them into the InDev channel. It's a public channel.
Yeah.
You can go peek if you want. But so we kind of get them engaged, right? Here is a documentation thing that somebody has to do. Here is an issue that you can work on. And also to self-support each other, right?
Yeah.
So if somebody knows a little bit more than somebody else, then they should be able to help the other person coming in, right? Like, so you set up that kind of a structure where you're not the single point of failure, but you are setting up a community for success, so to say. And like you can see how many KCDs are going on in India.
Of course, yeah.
And we have our first KubeCon in India in December. I'm so happy to see that happen finally.
I was about to bring that up, but before, I think that I like the way you described it, that if you want to increase participation from other parts of the world in an open source project, you have to be intentional about it. You cannot just expect it to happen, right?
Absolutely. It doesn't happen by itself.
Yeah. You have to be intentional. You have to have, and also you have to have role models, right? Like you have to have people who get involved first and then,
yes,
they inspire and pull more people. So,
yes. I'm an introvert by nature, but I have to get out of my skin to actually go do some of these things. But over a period of time, it works out.
Nice. And then KubeCon in India for the first time this year. I assume you're going.
I'm going. It doesn't matter one way or another, I'll be there.
Awesome. I think I've been talking to part of our team in APAC in the region, and I've been asked if I could go. So there is a possibility I will go. We'll see.
Thank you. That will be awesome.
That will be awesome.
Yeah, we'll have a lot of fun.
I've never been to India. We'll be very excited. I travel a lot. We were talking about this just before we started. Yeah. I travel a lot. I do. And when people ask me what I do, I tell them I travel to run, eat food, and then maybe there is a talk somewhere. So
yeah, that's by the way.
Yeah, that's third on the list of priorities of things to do. All right.
Yeah.
Cool. So what are you working on these days?
It's mostly cleanup, especially this cycle. We need to wrap up a few more things. But one important thing that we've been working on for the last year and a half is setting up alternate infrastructure on different cloud providers. Like, for example, we always run things on Google GCP platform, GKE. We use everything that is available on the Google Cloud platform. But when the credits came in from AWS early last year, we started setting up parallel CI/CD systems and making sure that when we are doing container images, it gets shipped local to the people who are trying to pull the container images from. So that has been awesome.
Nice.
Right? Especially in terms of reducing the dependency on specific people, specific teams, and specific vendors. And also so the main thing that I worry about these days is around sustainability. How do we exist as a project for the next 25 years, 50 years, right?
Yeah.
That is the kind of thing that we need to think about. This doesn't include just technical aspects, but also the people aspects.
Yeah.
How do we scale ourselves? How do we provide continuity? How do we make sure that the next generation of leaders are coming up? Things like that. So LFX mentorship, SIG Contribex, and SIG-Kates infra.
Yeah.
So that's where a lot of these work that I pay attention to and help out when I can.
Nice.
So yeah, that is very important to me
nice.
At this point.
And I just wanted to mention that I think SIG test infrastructure would probably be a good place for people who want to see how a large-scale project deal with CI/CD and
absolutely
kind of production-like systems, even if it's not technically production, but you don't really have to contribute code to Kubernetes itself. You can contribute code to the thing that supports Kubernetes.
Absolutely. So we have two things. One is SIG testing, and the other one is SIG Kubernetes infrastructure.
Yeah.
So in conjunction, both of them need to work together for sure. And yes, people, when they come to us, so there is some amount of trust building that is involved and some amount of sticking around that we require from the people. And we need to get to know them a little bit.
Of course, yeah.
So it's a little bit harder to get into, especially on the SIG-Kates infra side. But we've had some really good success. We had people like Marco Mudrich and folks like that who have come around, and Mohammed Upadroid on GitHub. And Arno, literally, they are running the things now. They are the chairs.
Yeah.
So from that point of view, we welcome a lot of people who from the DevOps background to contribute here. It doesn't have to be code that goes straight into the Kubernetes repository, for sure, like you said.
Yeah, that's another aspect of how you could contribute. But also just learn from it. It's a large-scale, multi-million dollars worth of credits spent on each cloud provider every year, right?
Yeah, it's $4 million this year.
It's insane, right?
This year we'll be spending $4 million across the two clouds.
I think if the Kubernetes project was a startup, it would probably be a unicorn, just in terms of how much money it spends on infrastructure, right?
The funniest thing is people don't even realize that they're using all this stuff for free, right?
Oh, yeah.
expect it, right? Like they expect it to be download any Kubernetes artifact from anywhere in the world, whenever they choose.
For free.
Right? Like they want to run any of the containers that we ship on any Kubernetes cluster they have on-prem or on any cloud without blinking an eye. And like, we've spoiled them literally.
Yeah, I don't want to go too much into the weeds, but there have been these whole discussions around whether open source projects are actually expected to just deliver an artifact, right? There is
absolutely like, yeah, I want to go back and say, this is source code, do whatever you want.
Build it yourself, right?
Yeah, otherwise it costs too much money.
Yes.
Where are we going to get the money from?
Exactly. All right, cool. One last question. I don't want to take too much of your time. What would you like to see next for the project?
I would like to see new set of leaders showing up. Mm-hmm. I specifically want people who work across the SIGs, not just in one specific SIG. Don't come here to, just do one feature in one SIG and be happy. I want you to go up and go across and be part of the community and lead the community for the future. Just like we showed up and we picked up some of the work, we would like other people to come and join us in this journey. It's going to be a long journey. Yes. All of us have finite lifetimes. So
yeah, and with AI and ML, Kubernetes is going to stick around for a very long time.
Absolutely.
It's going to be, there is always more work to do.
Yes, you said it.
Nice. Awesome. Thank you very much, James. Thanks for your time.
Thanks a lot. It was great talking to you and hope to talk to you in KubeCon India.
Hopefully. I'll let you know.
Okay.
Awesome. Thank you. Have a good one.
Bye.
Today, I'm super excited to be speaking with Federico Bongiovanni. He is an engineering manager at Google, and he started using Kubernetes in the early days at a previous company and then became a contributor about 6 years ago when he joined Google. Today, he's a co-chair of SIG-APIMachinery, along with our other guest, David Eads. And we're so excited to have you on today, Federico. Welcome to the show. Would you like to tell us more about yourself?
Yes, I first want to say the one that is super excited is me. It's an honor to be talking to you. And to be sharing this space with David and a lot of people that I respect a lot and that I've been working for so many years by now. Sometimes, they start feeling like friends more than co-workers. And I think that is one of the fantastic things about open source, right? Because, if you think about it, at some point is, different competing companies, in the abstract that come and work together to make something, better regardless who you work for. So that is something I really, really like.
That's definitely a big benefit of open source that we talk about all the time, right? Is that you have this community, this network around you that isn't just the folks that work with you at your company, but beyond that.
Yes. And certainly we can talk a little bit more about this, but I will say that one of the things that I've always hold myself accountable, and I learned that from the people that I work with, is the project comes always first, regardless the company that you work for. So there is no pressure that anybody can put, up the management chain of my company that is going to make us bend any rule or do something that is not a benefit for the entire community. So I don't like speaking about me a lot, but, for the sake of the story, I was working at a different company 8 years ago. Company is called MuleSoft. MuleSoft is an enterprise service bus, but I mentioned this because they also have an open source version of the commercial enterprise product that they have. So I was tied already with the open source community. And then at some point, we decided we run a large, cloud infrastructure, and we decided to explore Kubernetes. This is early days of Kubernetes, right? 2016, 17. And it was probably when all the hype was starting for Kubernetes, so we were one more, of the fans of the product and learning how it works, etc. And then one day I get a phone call from Google saying, hey, we saw your profile, we have a couple of options for you. And in honesty, they said 3 different projects, but I only remember one. There is the Kubernetes project. I was like, okay, what do you mean Kubernetes? Like doing what with Kubernetes? And recruiter was like, well, working in Kubernetes. I was like, okay, where do I go, right?
Where do I sign up?
Yes, exactly.
Love it.
Everything, yes. Whatever you ask me, check yes on all the questions. So yeah, I joined Google, long story short. And I can tell you more about that, but basically the team that I was put in charge initially was with some of the people that started the Kubernetes project, like Daniel Smith, who I love a lot. And I learned so much in such a short period of time, like from the project and becoming a contributor and, how it works. And then I started to understand, the broader community, and I met David Eads and Deems and many, many others. So it's been really, really a fantastic journey.
So when you came into Google, did you come in as an engineering manager working with open source Kubernetes, or did you come in as an individual contributor?
I came in as an engineering manager, yes.
I feel like that's a very unusual story. A lot of the folks that we talk to who are involved with open source Kubernetes are usually individual contributors who their day job is like writing code or something along those lines. But one thing I learn more and more as I get involved with the Kubernetes project is that there's so much management involved with all of it. So how do your management skills translate to your open source work? Do you use them a lot?
Yes, they do. And I think there is two parts of the story. At Google with the team, but it's not disconnected from the open source community, because many people on my team up to these days, they mostly work on open source, right? That is their job. And I think it's fantastic that we were able to keep it that way, right? I will tell you this is kind of confession funny story. So I joined this team, and Google is a very bottom-up company. Nobody tells you what to do, so figure out your job, right? We hire you.
Yep.
So I start to meet with these people, and, like, what do I have to do here? Like, they are so smart. They know everything, right? Imagine, Daniel Smith. Like, he wrote the part of the first lines of code of Kubernetes. And so I spent some time getting familiar with what was going on. And what I realized is that they didn't need another person to code. They were probably much better than me at coding. They didn't need, another manager to do code reviews. What they needed was a little bit of organization and priorities. That was one. And the other big one was, I think they were doing fantastic things, but please, nobody hates me when they hear this, but a lot of people around them didn't know what we were doing. Even at Google, we were doing all these fantastic features and enhancements and extensions, etc. So much technical work that there was not enough investment in building more awareness, right? And connecting with opportunities of, we are building this exactly for this use case. So I started to be that person, using, as you said, my management skills to organize a little bit the work and the priorities, make sure that it's sustainable, like people don't get overburned and things like that. But at the same time, connecting with the right opportunities, with other teams, other products, and other companies. So I think that is what I did to apply some of my different skills, not just coding and reviewing.
Yes. This is something that we talk about in open source a lot, is that we never have enough individual contributor type contributors, of course, who can write code and understand the code and, make improvements to Kubernetes as a project. But something that we're really lacking in open source Kubernetes, and that's really hard to attract to the project, is folks with those types of management skills, because we have to have those. As any kind of product that you've ever worked on in any company, you have to have those folks who are defining what those new features are going to look like, who they're for, helping to communicate to those people what they're for, and generally organizing the work. We need to create this, and then this, and this, and this, and who's going to do those pieces. And so people end up doing that in open source Kubernetes, even if they really prefer more of kind of the heads down coding type work. And so we have a lot of conversations about how can we encourage people to use those skills and build those skills, and also encourage people to come to the project who have management type skills. So I'm so excited to hear that works out for you.
Yeah, and another question that probably you will not ask me, but I want to say it felt supernatural and very welcoming, for me to bring this. Like, I'm a co-chair of the SIG. David is very different from me. He's much more technical, right? Like, there are many things that he can do that probably I can't do. But we divide and conquer, and, it doesn't feel like forced or anything like that. So that is what I wanted to say. It was very welcoming, the feeling I have. Like, I never heard anything about like, oh, you should code more, etc. Like, it was clear that I could contribute in other ways.
And I think that's kind of a theme that I've noticed in open source as well, is that we want folks to do the things that they're excited about and that they care about and that they have the skills to do, and like things that they're comfortable doing. And a lot of folks in open source are very type A, we might say. They love to pick up work. They love the project.
Yes.
And so they'll just pick up anything.
Yes.
But we kind of try to implement some checks and balances with each other and say, hey, no, you're really good at that and we need that done. So could you please do that?
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. So you've been involved with the project for 6 years, doing a lot of these management type things in SIG-APIMachinery. And you have, of course, a technical background as well. So I'm sure that you're deeply involved with a lot of the technical decisions that go into the project. So are there any particular early design decisions that you were involved with that have aged interestingly?
Yes, but I would say it's been evolving over the time. And when I started to be, more involved in the open source community of Kubernetes, initially I came from a very top-down company, right? So I was like, okay, the governance part must be SIG architecture, right? So I started to go to all the SIG architecture meetings. And then I was like, well, it doesn't sound like they are, vetoing or approving like everything. There is a lot of autonomy in each SIG, right? So I'm trying to say, like, I learned also that the Kubernetes community works more organically, and I think there is a bar in general, and SIG architecture, provides the guidelines and a lot of the things that are horizontal to the project. But then every SIG has a lot of autonomy, and there is a lot of trust put in every SIG, to make the right decisions for the project. Which is why, anecdotically, or between parentheses, it's really hard to, in a good way, to get to a place where you have the power, air quotes, power of approving, broader changes. Because, if you approve the wrong thing, can have horrible consequences, for the community. What was I involved? So I was involved, like large features. I was involved in server-side apply, largely. I was involved when we GA'd CRDs in 1.16. I remember that one. And lately, we've been working on a lot of features. Also, Kubernetes has been becoming more a mature project, over the years, I would say. So the way that we made decisions or technical designs, in Kubernetes 1.5 is not the way that we are doing them in 1.30, right? The needs are different, the customer base of the project is different, etc. And I will confess, at the beginning, I was super hesitant. I'm a shy person by nature, so I was like, what can I say in this conversation between all these like amazing giants of the project that can add anything? But then I realized that I did have a lot of background and experience, running big systems and all of that. So I started to participate more. And again, was always super welcome. That saying, there is no dumb questions, I think it's true, right? And even if you ask a dumb question, nobody's going to make you feel like you are. If you're asking, it's because you don't know. So in my experience, every time, I cannot recall a single time that didn't happen, at least in public meetings, like, somebody's going to take, the time of 30 seconds explaining you why what you're asking was already addressed or why it doesn't apply to this. So there were two things. One is scalability. I remember when we were discussing some of these features, there is always maybe because of working at Google, but maybe my own background, like the consideration about how does this scale, right? When the cluster gets bigger and things like that. But the one I remember most recently is, in SIG-APIMachinery, we are driving this initiative to adopt CEL, which is a technology that stands for Common Expression Language. So CEL is super powerful for doing things like validations for CRDs, for example. Instead of having to build a webhook to be able to validate some fields or something that you want to enforce, you can just on your deployment YAML, express some basic validation that you want to have. This is a string and cannot be empty, right? So now it simplifies a lot, etc. So it's a big change. We've been working on this for the last 2 years, I would say. Joe Betts and Cici, Juan from my team and others. And there was a lot of discussion about, customer feedback, how much is enough from this? Because we want to make technical decisions, but there is so much to do that it comes down to what is more important than what, and is this something that is going down the direction of what customers will want to use, right? Are we building the thing that is going to allow them to get rid of admission webhooks, right? And then that ties into the way that Kubernetes works, Alpha 2, Beta 1, we wait for how many releases until we can graduate. Do we have enough feedback? Was this enough? So I've been trying to help on that front. And I think we've been changing some of the priorities of what comes next. How much do we do for next release? Is this ready to graduate, or we need to collect more information, etc. That is the reason why.
Yeah, just like with any business, when you create
exactly
a product, you have a limited number of resources, a limited number of people, and limited amount of expertise to decide what you're going to work on. There's a million things that customers want, and you can only do some of them.
Exactly.
So always important.
And as you said, a lot of alpha people that want to do everything, but we can't do everything. The day has only 24 hours.
Yeah.
And there is only so many days, that you can dedicate to make changes in the code before code freeze, etc. So let's make sure that we are aligning the priorities in a meaningful way.
That is such an important part of the project. And thank you so much, Federico, for talking with me today about it. And I hope folks out there have learned something today, that these skills are very useful in open source Kubernetes. Maybe encourage your managers to get involved.
Yeah, to get more involved. We need more help all the time. Everybody's welcome.
Wonderful.
And if they don't know what to do, sorry to interrupt. Just come to me. Fede Bongio is my Slack handle. I have, a list longer than this screen of things that you could be helping me with.
Perfect. So definitely make sure that you reach out to Federico. Any other last tips for folks listening who might want to get involved?
I will say, it sounds like a cliche, the way of Kubernetes, because it's open source, is chop wood and carry water. So that is how you do it. You start small, you start getting involved, you earn the respect and your name slowly. And as long as you are consistent and you are willing to dedicate the time and effort, you're going to make progress for sure.
We hope to see you in the project someday,
yeah.
Listeners out there.
Totally.
Thank you so much, Federico.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
I'm so excited that we got to talk to these amazing members of the contributor community. DIMS, of course, recently submitted that over 1 million lines of code removed from the Kubernetes project, which we talked about a bit. And David Eads and Federico are folks that people may not have heard of before. They're deeper in the project, kind of. But I love their perspective. David being co-chair of a couple of different SIGs, and Federico being an engineering manager, talking about the different skills really that it takes to run a project of this size.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting to, first of all, talking to these three, you can already see the amount of maturity, and they've been around for a very long time. So it's a different crowd, I would say. I think in the 2 years we've been doing the podcast, I've never heard somebody talk that way. It was pretty interesting. And I guess it's just because we've been interviewing quite a lot of new people and people doing all sorts of interesting things. And we didn't really talk to the maintainers, the original maintainers, because they have been on the show in the past, right? So
it's also different now, it's the 10-year anniversary. So kind of looking back has a different feel to it.
Of course,
right
of course. Yeah. Yeah, I remember the first time I saw Dims and Tim was the Kubernetes maintainers read mean comments, the one they do each time at KubeCon. That's a lot of fun, actually.
KubeCon EU this year, actually, Dims and Tim did this talk called Kubernetes Maintainers Read Mean Tweets, I think is how
I think it was mean tweets or mean comments, something like that.
It was really just mean comments, mostly from GitHub. And I loved the way that they framed it. It was like, we're going to teach you a little bit about how you can communicate with the contributor community through counterexamples.
Yes. Through things you shouldn't do and say.
Yeah. And that room was packed. People could not get in. It was standing room only, and they stopped letting people in. So it wasn't really standing room only because I don't think they let people in to stand. But
it was packed. Yeah.
Fantastic talk.
Yeah, the talk is on YouTube. We'll make sure to have a link for it.
Yep. 10 years of reading mean comments.
Yes. But it's cool. Actually, I think I enjoyed a lot the talk with Federico, even if the interview was short. But being able to still contribute from like a management point of view, it's quite interesting because, again, each time we talk about open source, people just think code, but you also need all sorts of personalities and profiles to run a project like Kubernetes, right?
My favorite quote from the book Working in Public by Nadia Eghbal, which is about open source work, is people don't not join open source because they don't have the technical skills. They don't join it because they're afraid of committing a social faux pas. And I feel like the world of like all of the management and stuff that goes into the project that people don't really think about is one of those things that is easy for folks to miss from the outside.
Yeah, for
So
sure.
you come in and suddenly all of these people are doing management stuff all around you and you're like, wait a second, what am I doing?
And that's essentially what Federico was saying. It was like, yeah, what am I supposed to do here? What's going on?
I feel like there's some really good stuff in that book also that will speak to how important all of the management pieces are that go into open source. I feel like that was kind of my first look at it before I really dove into it in open source Kubernetes.
Yeah. I think I haven't read it yet. I should read it. We'll make sure that there is a link also in the notes.
Yeah.
Cool. And then, DIMS we discussed a little bit the 1.1 million plus line of code removal.
So exciting and terrifying.
So exciting. Yeah, the best way you can contribute to open source is remove code.
That is actually, we had huge discussions about that at KubeCon EU at the Contributor Summit, because Kubernetes is so big now. And in Tim's keynote about the 10-year anniversary, he was saying one of the big things that the project needs to do over the next decade is streamline. It's going to be more important than ever to keep the project in a good, line, not letting it get so terribly complex and branch out so much that it just becomes completely unwieldy and people lose focus on it, which it's already a huge community and a huge ecosystem, but kind of managing that is where the next decade of work is going to have to focus.
Yeah. I think the interview with David was really cool, especially, version 1.0 of Kubernetes did not have namespaces and did not have whatever other features.
Yes.
It's like, okay.
Man. I loved this look back so much. It's so cool hearing about the early days from folks who are still involved. It's like, wow, this has really changed a lot.
Yes.
And from the early days when there were no SIGs to this.
Yeah, of course, yeah. The community was like, whatever, whoever has time, do stuff, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep. That was such an interesting perspective to hear from all of these folks, is that when they joined the community, it was just like things were happening. And there were some of these areas that we were like, we know we need to figure this out. And you just kind of dove into it. Whereas these days, I feel like when you start contributing, it's a lot more intimidating in a way because there's so much more structure in place.
Yes.
There's all of the special interest groups, and half of them have names that are not completely obvious when you first read them. Once you dive in, they usually make sense. But like, which SIG should I go to? How does all of this work? There's some kind of leadership thing going on here, and there was none of that in the beginning.
Yeah. And also the fact that there are some SIGs that are, like, for example, what Dims mentioned in the interview, there are some SIGs that require some more stability, like the test infrastructure and also SIG infrastructure. So that's all the GCP, AWS setup, where build infrastructure is, and test infrastructure and release infrastructure, and it's kind of harder to get into. And then once you are in it, you need to commit like a minimum amount of time. But on the other hand, actually, in the conversation, because I've been wanting to actually get involved in one of the SIGs, and I think those SIGs makes a lot of sense for me because it's more on the infrastructure side of things rather than coding for Kubernetes itself. So it was an eye-opening conversation.
Yeah, setting up those clusters.
Yeah.
Setting up the clusters to like test each release and stuff is huge.
Yes. And setting up the serving infrastructure, like serving the images, right? And all the stuff that goes into the project that is not part of Kubernetes code base itself, right? Everything around it.
And I love that you all talked about the budget.
Oh, yes.
Such an interesting topic in Kubernetes because we spend hundreds of millions of dollars a year to provide pre-built artifacts to users. And as Dims was saying, people kind of expect that now, but it costs a lot of money to do that. People don't realize. And there have been a couple of times where the project has nearly run out of money. because of serving those artifacts. And so we've had to like go to the cloud providers and say, hey, we really need some more money to be able to run this stuff so that we can continue and like work out new deals with the cloud providers. Dims was mentioning AWS giving the community a whole bunch of credits that we've been using lately. Of course, Google Cloud still provides a whole lot of credits to the community for all of these activities like testing releases, delivering releases, the artifacts and all of that stuff. Diving into the budget is fascinating. And we actually have a project going on in open source right now where we're working on a blog post about not really the budget breakdown, but like, I guess kind of the budget breakdown, like how we use all of that money and why it takes so much and all of that stuff. So look out for that blog post in the future. I would include a link, but it's not there yet.
Yeah, that would be cool to read. I think we can discuss this later, but I think I want probably to have Dims in a separate episode where we talk about specifically this expectation in open source. Like people just expect certain stuff. And I'm like, as long as you release code, you are doing open source, right? You don't have to provide an artifact technically.
Yep. And see, this is going to be the problem with all of these 10-year anniversary episodes. After I was done talking with Fede, I was like, I just want to do a whole other episode with Fede.
Yes. There's so many opportunities for discussions.
Yeah, and I let the David conversation go to about the length of one of our normal interviews, even though it's a multi-interview episode, because it was just so interesting. And that's just going to happen with all of these episodes, and they're all going to have multiple guests. So look forward to more content.
Yeah. Cool. So what are your plans for 10 years? You're going to the Bayview party?
Yeah, I hope so. I've still got to get that travel approved.
All right.
I'm not speaking there or anything, but I've been helping out with some of the planning around like what activities are going to be happening there and stuff. So I'm hoping that I can be there on site to see how it goes and interact with the community and make sure that all of the activities are going smoothly. So yeah, I hope to be on site at the June 6th party. And by the way, we're planning to release an episode
on June 6th.
On June 6th, or at least very close to it.
Yes.
So, which is off our normal schedule, but we got to celebrate the birthday.
Yes, we will have to. I think I'm going to have to do that because I think you're going to be traveling that day. I will be also traveling, but much later in the day. So if the episode is ready on time, I'll publish it.
Yeah, you have quite the activities coming up for the 10-year anniversary as well, don't you?
Yes. Actually, on the 6th of June, I'm going to a meetup in Bergen in Norway. This is a city in the west part of Norway, the west coast, and it's one of my favorite parts of Norway. It's just a really beautiful city. So I'm going to be there for a meetup with the local community. And then on the 10th, which is the week after, I'm going to be in Aarhus in Denmark, different city, Denmark, talking about Gateway API, different meetup, but also celebrating the 10 years anniversary. And now I don't remember which one, but there will be a cake at one of them.
So don't forget, no matter where you are in the world, look into what Kubernetes parties or meetups or events are happening near you. There are so many of them.
There's lots.
It's so exciting. There are so many active communities.
Yeah. When we were preparing for this episode, I was looking at the list. I was like, that's a lot. It's like 50 plus events. So make sure to hit one of them.
Awesome. I'm looking forward to all of the 10-year stuff. Please post stuff on social media so that we can see it. Like, tell us about what you're doing. We'd love to hear from you all about what you're doing to celebrate 10 years of Kubernetes.
Yes, please. I think if you post on X, just feel free to tag us. We'll make sure we retweet your whatever post.
Or on LinkedIn.
Or LinkedIn, one of them. So, all right, cool.
We'll see you on the internet.
We'll see you on the internet. Thank you, Kathleen.
Thank you. That brings us to the end of another episode. If you enjoyed this show, please help us spread the word and tell a friend. If you have any feedback for us, you can find us on social media at KubernetesPod or reach us by email at kubernetespodcast@google.com. You can also check out the website at kubernetespodcast.com, where you'll find transcripts, show notes, and links to subscribe. Please consider rating us in your podcast player so we can help more people find and enjoy the show. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time. By the way, we do that end bit every time. You're welcome.